Every now and again, history gives us a story that absolutely refuses to make sense. The story of the Dyatlov Pass incident is definitely one of those. In 1959, in then Soviet Russia, 9 experienced hikers set off into the northern Ural Mountains for what should have been a tough but routine expedition. A few weeks later, a rescue team located their tent, realizing it had been ripped open from the inside. To make it even more unsettling, they noticed that the hikers' equipment, food, and clothing had been left behind. But the hikers, at least at first, were nowhere to be found. The searchers found footprints leading from the camp into the forest, so they followed the footprints, and that's when the bodies started showing up. Some of the bodies were still relatively intact, showing routine signs of exposure, while others were found under mysterious and unexplained conditions. There were no signs of a struggle or of an animal attack. The Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those stories where the deeper you look into it, the stranger it becomes. If you enjoy content like this, feel free to subscribe so you can make sure to catch the next case. The story begins in January 1959 when 10 students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute set off on a winter expedition up into the northern Ural Mountains. This was not a casual climb. They were attempting to achieve a Category 3 route, which was the hardest officially recognized trek in the Soviet Union at that time. If successful, they would earn the highest mountaineering certification in the Soviet Union at that time, which was called the Master of Sport. For young Soviet citizens back in the 1950s, this achievement would be way more than just a title. It was really a way to embody the very resilience that their country demanded during the Cold War era. This was not a group of thrill seekers or hobbyists. They were disciplined, experienced, and a tightly knit group. The leader of the group was named Igor Dyatlov, hence the name the Dyatlov Pass and the Dyatlov Pass incident. Igor was 23 years old, he was very methodical, he was inventive, and he was very well respected. Zina Kolmogorova was also 23, and she was known to be spirited and tireless. She was also thought of as the glue that helped keep morale high among the group. Lyudmila Dubanina was the youngest member at 20 years old, and she was quite fiery, tough, and outspoken. Rustam Slobodin, who was also 23, was athletic, stubborn, and very competitive. Alexander Kolevatov was 24 years old, and he was more reserved. He was quiet and analytical. Yuri Doroshenko was 21 years old, and he was always remembered as fearless. So much so, in fact, that there's even a story of him having once fought off a bear with nothing but an axe handle. Though that tale was likely just campfire legend, it really shows a lot about how they viewed him in the group. That's quite a legend to have your name attached to. Nikolai Thibault-Brignon was 23 years old. He was of French descent, and he was sociable, warm-hearted, and very well-liked. Yuri Krivonashenko was 23 years old. He was the group prankster. Even in harsh conditions, he was always making the best of things, having a good time. The last one to go on the expedition was Semyon Zolotaryov. He was definitely an outlier within the context of this group. He was 38 years old, significantly older than the rest of the group members. He was also a war veteran and a last-minute addition to the group. He was older, tougher, and mysterious. The 10th member, named Yuri Yudin, fell ill very early on and had to turn back. Ironically, his illness is what spared his life. For the remaining 9 hikers, this journey promised friendship, challenge, and a legacy that they could be proud of. None of them could have imagined that their names, especially poor Igor Dyatlov, would instead be remembered by this tragic, unsolved mystery. The group's diaries and photographs, which were recovered later, showed a group that was full of life, singing, laughing, pulling sleds through the deep snow, and smiling for the camera, exhausted but united. On February 1st, they made camp on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, which in the local Mansi language is often translated to Dead Mountain. Whether they actually knew that meaning was uncertain, but it would prove chillingly prophetic. It's also uncertain as to why they chose to make camp on the exposed slope as opposed to the forested valley below. Perhaps they wanted to practice camping in difficult conditions, or maybe nightfall simply forced their hand. Sadly, that would be their last night. Weeks later, a rescue team found the group's tent, which had been sliced open from the inside. Boots, coats, and food were all left behind. Bare and socked footprints led into the forest. The rescue team followed the footprints, and right at the timberline under a large cedar tree, they located Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonashenko, half-dressed beside the remnants of a small fire. Doroshenko had burns on his legs and face, singed hair, and bruised knuckles. Krivonashenko had burns on one foot and torn skin on his hands. Exactly what caused the burns remains uncertain, possibly contact with fire attempting to stay warm, but possibly something stranger. A little further down slope, searchers found Igor Dyatlov, lightly dressed, missing his shoes. One of his fists had been bloodied, as though he had tried to crawl back to the tent. Zina Kolmogorova was also located near Dyatlov, similarly underdressed, also apparently attempting to head back towards the camp. About a week later, Rasim Slobodin was located. He was discovered between Kolmogorova and Dyatlov, and he had a small skull fracture, most likely from falling down. The remaining 4 hikers were not found until May, when a second expedition went out after the spring thaw. In a ravine about 75 meters past the tree line into the woods were Lyudmila Dubanina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignon, and Semyon Zolotaryov. Dubanina's injuries were especially disturbing. Missing tongue, eyes and lips, and severe chest fractures. These missing tissues were most likely the result of decomposition and animal activity. However, they strongly contributed to the tragedy's haunting imagery. Kolovatov was well dressed, but his neck was oddly twisted, and some of his facial tissue was missing. Thibault-Brignon had suffered a massive skull fracture. He had no external wounds and likely died instantly. His cause of death was later ruled to be from internal bleeding from the massive skull fracture. Zolotaryov's ribs were absolutely crushed, with force comparable to that of a car crash. His camera was still hanging around his neck, and he also had some tissue missing on his face, including his eyes. Rather predictably, the Soviet investigation ended swiftly and silently. Their official verdict, if you can even call it that, is that they died due to an unknown compelling force. They basically said that they didn't know what caused the deaths, and then they didn't follow up on it, at least publicly. So naturally, the public did what it always does when answers aren't public. It started speculating. In the absence of answers, aside from unknown compelling force, which satisfied no one, theories exploded. The most common and probably still most accepted theory is that an avalanche is what killed the Dyatlov group. However, there have always been criticisms of the avalanche theory as well. The slope being too shallow, the tent having too little damage, and that an avalanche really doesn't explain some of the more severe injuries. In 2020, researchers Johan Gom and Alexander Puzrin used computer modeling to simulate a delayed slab avalanche, which is a block-like section of densely packed snow that can break loose along a hidden weak layer beneath the surface. In this case, it may have slid several hours after the hikers cut into the slope to pitch their tent. Their findings, which were published in Communications, Earth and Environment, showed that a small slab release could indeed crush the tent, cause severe blunt force injuries, and trigger a panicked evacuation. The physics worked just as nature, not conspiracy, might explain it. Still, not every detail fits neatly. The staggered locations of the body, their partial clothing, the long distances traveled barefoot through the deep snow, those keep the story uneasy. Meanwhile, rumors of glowing fireballs over the Urals that night spread through witness reports. Likely meteor or military activity, but impossible to verify. Some researchers suggest that the hikers stumbled into the aftermath of a military accident. The Soviet R-12 missile, which is fueled by corrosive nitric acid oxidizers, could have rained toxic fumes or debris across the slopes, which would obviously cause immediate panic, slashing open the tent, rushing out half-dressed, choking, being disoriented, etc. Melted snow was located near the tent, and it could have been residue from chemical burns or released heat from falling rocket material. Some of the victim's skin was also oddly discolored, described by their relatives as somewhat of an orange or bronze hue. Some people speculate that rather than the cold, this could have been caused by chemical exposure. Traces of radioactivity did appear on some of the hikers' clothing, but that could be explained by their past nuclear work. However, it's still deeply unsettling to think about. If that was true, it's no surprise at all that there was a cover-up, because in 1959, admitting such a failure would have been absolutely out of the question for the Soviets. Another theory points to Mother Nature being the culprit in the form of katabatic winds. Katabatic winds are violent downslope gusts that can produce infrasound vibrations. Such low-frequency noise can trigger panic and disorientation, possibly explaining the sudden flight from their tent. It's speculative, but certainly possible. A similar event occurred in 1978 in Sweden's Ural Mountains, where hikers fled their tent in a storm and died of exposure. There were 9 hikers in that group as well, one of which survived. The parallels are haunting. There's also a lot of mystery surrounding Semyon Zolotaryov, the war veteran who joined at the very last minute. Zolotaryov's relatives lived very far away from where he was recovered, so they were unable to identify his body in person. However, when they were shown photographs, they were quite surprised as they were unaware he had multiple visible tattoos, igniting fresh theories about identity swaps, a man living under false papers, or even someone connected to Soviet intelligence. In 2018, Zolotaryov's remains were exhumed for DNA testing. Early media reports claimed that the results didn't match his relatives, stirring even more controversy. Later, under proper testing, the DNA did match, confirming the body was his after all. The rumor somewhat faded, but the doubt that it sparked, along with so many other things, has never fully disappeared. And then there was the famous photograph, which was recovered later from the group's film. One blurry frame captured a shadowy, ominous-looking figure lurking way off in the distance and almost appeared as though it was stalking the group. Although it was very blurry, the proportions of this figure looked highly strange. It had very long arms and a distorted outline. It was far too vague to confirm anything specific, but also far too suggestive to outright dismiss. The hikers had even joked in their makeshift wall newspaper about snowmen lurking in the wilderness. To later readers, some saw that as an ominous foreshadowing. So is it possible that a predator was stalking them? No tracks or fur were found, and there was no sign of an attack, but that image that shows a large figure with limb proportions that look more like a Sasquatch than a human still haunts the case. The snowman or Yeti theory survives, not so much on evidence, but on the vacuum of everything else not making sense. To this day, nobody truly knows what happened. It could very likely have been a slab avalanche, but it also could have been a secret missile test. It could have been a force of katabatic wind and infrasound that shattered their nerves. It could have been radiation, chemical exposure. It could have even been something stranger, such as a Yeti attack. Every piece of evidence in this case, from the fireballs reported over the Urals, to the unexplained injuries, to Zolotaryov's ambiguous identity, to the missing tongues and eyes, it leaves the door open for speculation. And that's why the Dyatlov Pass captivates people to this day. It kind of exists at a crossroads between science and superstition, and secrecy and imagination. On the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, the dead mountain, the snow still holds their secrets, and the silence is louder than any answer. Thank you for watching.